Welcome to Politico Live. My name is Carlo Martuscelli, healthcare policy reporter with Politico. Today we're here to speak about how the pandemic has sparked a new phase in government involvement in the pharmaceutical sector on both sides of the Atlantic. As a response to COVID-19, governments are taking a much more hands-on approach to an industry which is now seen as increasingly strategic. It's a relationship that is at times marked by close collaboration and other times disagreement and even antagonism. We're going to take this opportunity to compare and contrast what's going on with Washington with Europe and to debate what has worked and what hasn't. This event is part of the Evolution of Healthcare series, and we'll dig into these issues and discuss the changing role of government in medical innovation, from investment in research to supply chains and intellectual property, and how strategies are converging or diverging on both sides of the Atlantic. I want to give a big thank you to our sponsor Janssen for making this event possible, and thank you to our viewers who are watching the event online. I encourage all of you to send your questions via Slido using the hashtag #EvolvedHealthcare. The process to access Slido is simple. Go to slido.com from your computer or phone and use the hashtag #EvolvedHealthcare to ask your questions. I'm happy to start the discussion with a poll presented by our sponsor, Janssen. The question is, which are the key areas where we should strengthen transatlantic collaboration to allow for sustainable innovation of medicines? Is it open trade and free flow of goods? Collaboration between authorities like Herta and BARDA? Is it greater regulatory harmonization between markets? Or is it IP and incentives frameworks? We'll be looking at the results after the panel discussion. But before that, you'll hear from Anouk Devroy, Head of Government Affairs and Policy, EMEA, Pharmaceuticals and Vaccines at Johnson & Johnson, as well as from Kevin Buckley, Senior Director of Global Government Affairs Supply Chains at Johnson & Johnson. We'll now be watching their opening remarks, which have been pre-recorded.
Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. It's now almost 2 years since the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis started. Since the beginning, governments on both sides of the Atlantic got more involved in shaping and supporting medical innovation and supply. We saw an increase in public-private collaboration, trying to overcome the pandemic. This has helped us to build trust between partners. We've learned a lot from it. In this context, governments will have a key role to play by stimulating medical innovation in areas of unmet need and prepare for future crises. Governments can put forward policies to support this evolution. In Europe, we have a long-standing history of life science ecosystems with an active pharmaceutical industry. To keep this position, we need to ensure that we future-proof regulatory systems and continue to recognize the importance of intellectual property rights to stimulate innovation. The pandemic has shown us that public-private sector collaboration is a key factor to accelerate innovation. Let's further build on this and reflect where more international collaboration and collaboration between Europe and the US can further accelerate innovation. As an international community, we need to create a sustainable innovation strategy. I would like to give some initial thoughts on areas of focus, which I hope we can discuss further together. First of all, accelerate the digitalization of healthcare at a global scale. And for instance, increase acceptance of new digital endpoints for use in clinical trials. Secondly, we should ensure greater regulatory harmonization between regions, in particular during times of crisis, but also beyond. Thirdly, the role, but also strengthening IP and incentive frameworks to stimulate innovation which patient needs should be recognized. And lastly, we need to continue to stimulate collaboration between authorities and the private sector across the Atlantic and at a global scale. For instance, how can industry work together with agencies like BARDA and the future HERA to be better prepared for a next pandemic? I'll now hand over to my colleague Kevin Buckley to talk about global supply chains and the importance of open trade and dialogue.
Thanks, Anouk, and thanks to Politico and to our panelists for making today's discussion possible. This pandemic has taught us that acceleration of game-changing innovation happens when all stakeholders work together. And we cannot underestimate how collaboration within supply chains will strengthen our resiliency and flexibility in responding to future health emergencies. An important part of this collaboration are policymakers who are responding in real time to the current pandemic and preparing for future emergencies. We must be mindful of the complexities and potential disruptions of undermining carefully established and functioning supply chains, while proactively enabling policy solutions that encourage the free flow of goods across borders, allow for better risk mitigation, and adoption of next-generation technologies. This will reduce shortages, cost fluctuations, and disruption of patient care. Measured actions can ensure more resilient, integrated, and sustainable global medical supply chains. But we can't do it alone. A greater sense of shared responsibility and collaboration is required for the global manufacturing community and policymakers to navigate the future. That's why today's discussion is so important. Resilient supply chains that can deliver to patients in need anywhere in the world, when they need it, are critical to changing the trajectory of health for humanity. Across the globe, we're helping to change this trajectory through our partnerships, advocacy, and policy efforts for the millions of patients around the world whom we all serve. This is how we will all protect progress for patients. Thanks again to Politico for convening us, and we look forward to this important discussion.
Great. A big thank you to our partner, Janssen, and we'll be discussing many of those topics mentioned just now. In this panel discussion, I'm joined by Natalie Moll, Director General of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, Michelle McMurry-Heath, a board member of Research America and CEO of BIO, Rosemary Gibson, Senior Advisor at the Hastings Center, and we will also be joined by Dolores Montserrat, MEP for the EPP. She will just be joining us a little bit later. To kick off the discussions, I wanted to start with a rapid fire question, if we can just keep it to under a minute. And the question is, has the pandemic been a positive or a negative for how the government approaches the pharmaceutical sector? And Natalie, maybe we can start with you, and then go to Michelle, and then go to Rosemary. So over to you, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, for being here today. The quick question. I think certainly what has changed is the understanding of how our industry works, how our global supply chain works, and how it's important to collaborate in any moment, but especially in the case of a pandemic. And hopefully we've learned a little bit on the value of those collaborations and the win-wins that we can get out of them. And I look forward to building on them as Europe decides on its new pharma strategy and a revision of all this legislation.
Thanks for that. Michelle?
Well, I guess my short answer would be both. I mean, it's definitely increased the level of urgency and level of engagement between governments and the industry, which is most certainly welcome. But in that haste, I think it's also increased some of the misconceptions and perhaps unintended consequences of some well-meaning policies. So I think this is time for us to calibrate and level set and keep the great new level of engagement with perhaps some more positive outcomes ahead.
Great. We'll be diving into some of those, maybe mistakes or divergences that you mentioned. But Rosemary, over to you.
I think the COVID pandemic showed us how vulnerable our medicine supply chain is. The United States was weeks away from the strategic national stockpile not having essential medicines needed for hospitals to function in the country. And it highlighted the importance to take a look at where our supply chains, where they are, where they come from. And right before COVID hit, a professor at Johns Hopkins testified that more than 200 to 300 drugs were in shortage, and major hospitals were bartering with each other, the Mayo Clinic, University of Pennsylvania, for basic medicines. This was in Senate testimony in March 2020. So this has brought to the fore the need for us to take a close look at our medicine supply chain and to fix it so we're better prepared for the next pandemic.
Great. Yes, we'll certainly be returning to that point on shortages and the vulnerability of the supply chain shortly. But I thought maybe to kick things off, we can start with you, Michelle. As someone who has worked in the industry as well as in government, I was curious to get you to elaborate on some of those points that you mentioned just now. What has worked and what hasn't, in your opinion? And both before the COVID-19 and during COVID-19, and how do you see things evolving, in the aftermath?
Well, we definitely saw the proof of principle that governments coming in and guaranteeing markets for high-risk enterprises that are essential to public health works. We saw that with the Strategic National Stockpile, which was mentioned. We saw it with Operation Warp Speed. I'm talking on the US side now, but we also saw it globally with efforts like COVAX, the idea that government should come in and agree to pre-purchase pharmaceuticals that are essential to the functioning of society is a principle that worked somewhat well during the pandemic. It definitely got us to the level of innovation that was needed and the speed of innovation that was required. On the flip side, I think we saw that those partnerships led to sometimes a misunderstanding of the role that government was playing in those innovations. There was an assumption that because some government investment had been in place or some government pre-purchasing agreements had been in place, that government was therefore responsible for the totality of the investment that went into making those biomedical breakthroughs, or a lack of attention to the 9 out of 10 of those research projects that failed. So for example, we saw globally that the industry started over 1,000 research and development programs targeted at COVID, over 250 of which were vaccines in development. And yet we're ending with a half dozen vaccines that will actually be used in the clinic. We have to realize that as a society, we need to cover the cost both of the successes and of the failures if we want to have as many shots on goal as it really takes to make sure that you end up with something that works at the end of the day.
Michelle, am I reading between the lines here a little, or are you also referring to the I guess you could say, tussle we're seeing between Moderna and the U.S. government over, who did what with certain patents? Is that one example?
That's part of it. I mean, I think there's an assumption that since NIH partnered with Moderna and that Operation Warp Speed pre-purchased some doses, that means that was the totality of the investment. But actually, if you look in retrospect, the US government, for one, contributed about 1/10 of the total investment needed to bring Moderna's COVID vaccine to market, and was involved in just a minority of the patents that it took and the trade secrets that it took to get something to work. So we need to be grateful that we're seeing collaboration and partnership between federal science agencies and policymakers and private sector companies. But we need to realize that it takes more than just that to get to the point where you have something that helps patients and saves and protects lives. And we need both at the end of the day. We can't do it without one or the other. And that's the relationship that I hope we come to appreciate in the period post-pandemic.
Great. Natalie, I wanted to ask you, leading on from Michelle, we were just talking about the US, but we have some big changes coming for Europe as well. And I'm talking about regulation, obviously. Next year is going to see the Commission publish its proposal to change the basic pharmaceutical legislation. What's your opinion of where the direction is going? And do you have a sense of what we might be seeing further down the line?
Well, thanks for the question, Carlo, and really interesting. I mirror many of the comments that were made by Michelle earlier in general on the experience at the moment. What surprises me and perhaps the industry a little today is that with this incredible opportunity we have at European level of reviewing the whole legal framework for pharmaceuticals, and I mean the whole thing, and that hasn't been reviewed in about 20 years. We're not seeing in the consultations that we see published and in the roadmaps that we see, we're not seeing a clear indication to investors and to the healthcare community that what is being thought of are ways of making Europe the innovative center of medical research. When I look at the consultation that was published a few weeks ago, there are a lot of questionings around IP. There are proposals to change the IP framework. If you're a scientist or an investor, like me, you will know that the last thing you want, if you want to attract investment and if you want to stabilize or even increase your innovation base, is to destabilize intellectual property. So I think we are in a crucial moment at European level. We have an incredible opportunity to make sure that our regulation is at pace with the scientific developments that have occurred in the last 20 years, which are astounding and wonderful and have led to a whole new way of treating disease and sometimes of even finding cures. But we cannot afford to give the wrong signals by making the wrong decisions and turn Europe even further back in the race to be competitive as an innovation region. That is a decision that policymakers have to make now, and we really hope they make the right decisions.
Do you think there's been too much of a focus in the conversation on the manufacturing aspect and not enough on innovation?
There's been a lot of focus on manufacturing because, as previous speakers mentioned, there were moments where for products that were not innovative, there were possibly some shortages. In our area, that wasn't the case. Our supply chains were very robust, at least at European level, and those are global supply chains. And you have to make sure, it takes a whole process to make a product. You have to also have the research and innovation. Research and innovation in a region is important also because attached to that are not only investments, but also clinical trials. And clinical trials means patients getting products quickly. And Europe has, a history of being very strong in clinical trials. We've fallen behind on research and development. This is the opportunity to catch up again with this review. And we really hope that European policymakers will see that, after learning from the COVID pandemic, how important it was to have BioNTech and those kind of companies here, in order to have those companies here and to have those companies with those products, it's not a one shot. It's something that requires an investment of 20 years and an environment in which investors are happy to invest for 20 years and companies are happy to build for those 20 years.
Great. Thanks for that. Rosemary, I wanted to go over to you next to discuss the issue of supply chains. I think it's fair to say that the sector prefers a light touch when it comes to regulation. At the same time, at least on the manufacturing side, industry has been given freedom to produce where they find convenient. How has this played out in the past 10 years, and what did we see during the pandemic?
What we saw during the pandemic, Carlo, is that more than 75 countries banned exports of medicines, components, and medical supplies because they needed these products for their own people. And governments are compelled to do that because that's their obligation. And so that jump-started conversations, very good ones, I believe, about how we can invest in innovations in manufacturing. I think there's tremendous opportunity for R&D and actual production in advanced manufacturing, and particularly on the generic drugs, which are commodity products. And these generics are 90% of what is prescribed in the United States, and I think the figure is even higher in Europe. And there's tremendous opportunity for public-private partnerships with advanced manufacturing. And this fits, and we can make products faster, cheaper, and much greener. And with the climate change focus and the need for more green manufacturing, this would be a win-win all around. And it's important to underscore that we have to address a bottleneck that we have in our supply chain. According to leaders in industry in the United States and Europe, those who are actually turn innovations into product, 90% of the starting materials that are needed for certainly our generic drugs, which are thousands of medicines that are used in the ICUs and emergency rooms and clinics. They're sourced from a single country. And we learned during the pandemic that centralization of the global supply of these core components is a catastrophe waiting to happen. It's like the rare earth situation. So there's opportunity for governments and industry to partner together to invest in advanced manufacturing that would be good for the environment and good for creating much more resilient supply chains. And in some places, those supply chains will be closer to home. It's good for public health as well as security and giving the public the assurance that when we need medicines, that they'll be there.
Great. Thanks for that, Rosemary. I want to stick with the U.S. side of the conversation because I think it's interesting to see what Europe, can learn from America and also maybe things to avoid as well. So, Michelle, I wanted to go back over to you and get your take on BARDA. In what ways has it been successful? And if it has been successful, what is it that made it work? Because the Commission recently introduced its plans to roll out a kind of a European BARDA called Herta, and it's still under construction somewhat. So I'd be interested to know, what is the kind of secret ingredient in the American one?
Well, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill close to 20 years ago when BARDA was first being conceptualized, and Senator Lieberman, who I worked for, was one of the architects. And the key premise was that the innovation was going to come from the private sector, that just like large pharmaceutical companies, federal governments are ill-equipped for the kind of nimble, high-risk, almost cowboy-like dynamism and adventurism that you need to do cutting-edge science and really be at the tip of our scientific knowledge when it comes to turning insights into solutions for patients. But at the same time, when you're looking for solutions that you hope you'll never need, i.e. a solution that for a bioterrorism attack that you hope will never come, or a solution for an antimicrobial resistance that you see sporadically, but once you have a product that treats that resistant bacteria, you need to keep it on a shelf and use it very sparingly so that it continues to be effective. In those situations where you're never going to have a natural market for a biomedical breakthrough, then it makes sense for the federal government to come in and right that imbalance, to have purchasing agreements, to incentivize the creation of breakthroughs, and to provide some financial assurances to investors in that space that there will be a market, even if it's a market for a stockpile that may or may not get employed, that is there at the end of the day. All of those concepts worked. It made sense for the government to partner with early stage adventurous biotechs. It made sense for BARDA to help those biotechs figure out how to commercialize their products. It made sense for BARDA to stabilize the market that at some points is almost fictitious, but is needed at the end of the day as a safeguard. Those are all things that worked. What doesn't work as well is when government tries to replicate what the biotech ecosystem does on its own. I spent many years at Johnson & Johnson. I see Janssen is one of the sponsors today. And there is a recognition that when you reach the size and scope of some of our larger pharmaceutical companies, what you're amazingly good at is scaling up production, conducting complex global clinical trials, getting solutions out to patients in every corner of the globe. But what you struggle with perhaps is maybe that really nimble initial cutting edge innovation. And so even large companies in the private sector also partner with these small, nimble biotechs. So if I have any advice to the European drafters, I would say don't try to reinvent the biotech ecosystem, support the biotech ecosystem, and make sure you have all the incentives in place for more young startups to start and more investors to support their work.
Great. Well, I guess that segues very naturally into Natalie, getting your opinion on HERA. I mean, do you think it ticks those boxes that BARDA has that Michelle was talking about just now?
I think, Michelle said it very well. I mean, for us to play our role and enable the development of assets to be able to respond within 100 days, for example, from the declaration of a critical health threat, you need to make sure that you prioritize technology platforms and priority pathogens and the things you're going to work on together with industry. And for us at the moment, I think to ensure seamless coordination and information exchange and to make sure we get it right, we would really encourage policymakers to define a greater involvement of the private sector in that. A sort of joint industrial cooperation forum, something permanent, a structure that will allow continuous interaction on scenario planning, science and technology opportunities and resources. I think that's made a difference, and it will ensure that we are actually effective because we are already cumbersome. We're not a country like the US. We are a region with 27 member states. That always makes things a little bit slower. And in times of crisis, we have no opportunity to stand behind and take things more slowly. So I think we have to do things differently in HERA compared to everywhere else. We've been amazing at doing that off the cuff in this time of crisis, but now we should have learned. So if we've learned, then we need to set up things that are different and more effective. And that's not easy, of course, but we've done lots of things that weren't easy in the last maybe 2 years. So I have confidence that we can do this if we all listen to each other properly.
Great. One of the roles of HERA is actually to monitor supply chains. So, Rosemary, I wanted to ask you this question, which is, one of the big sources of pharmaceutical ingredients in the world and generic products is China. And you've written a book about this, China RX, looking at the role of China in pharmaceutical manufacturing. As I'm sure HERA is going to investigate, the upstream supply chains for all the medical products that we use in hospitals every day, and they'll see that China is such a big source of them. Can you describe what the role of China is right now, and how should this orient countries' strategic thinking in terms of, government involvement into whether they should be shoring up manufacturing back at home or not?
Yes, Carlo. We have a single country, whatever country it is, China, has made very strategic investments, and as a consequence, it dominates with 90% of the global supply of raw materials and other critical starting materials, certainly for the generic industry, which is thousands of basic medicines. And the world wouldn't have 90% of its oil coming from a single country, whatever country it is. We wouldn't have 90% of essential food commodities coming from a single country. So there's been a lot of discussion in the United States about the importance, and other countries, about diversifying our manufacturing base. And there's tremendous opportunity for the government as an innovator in procurement. How does it use its purchasing power to diversify that manufacturing base? And in so doing, making sure it's more resilient. There's also a role for government to prevent companies from being subject to price fixing, dumping. And a recent report came out from the Coalition for Prosperous America, which is a bipartisan nonprofit group in Washington, D.C., and it documented the price manipulation that goes on from countries in Asia. And that has hurt the ability of the United States and other countries to be able to have a solid manufacturing base for some of the most important medicines we need to survive. And the United States has virtually no capacity to make antibiotics. That is a tremendous risk from the perspective of bacterial infections, infectious disease. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for government, not only as an investor in much cleaner manufacturing processes, but also in procuring to shore up a critical sector of our economy, but also to assure public health in the event of the next pandemic. Or look what's happening off of the coast of California. How many APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and core components are sitting in cargo ships, 100 plus cargo ships floating around in the Pacific? And what's the temperature and humidity control? We have to think about, just for the most essential generics, how we can diversify the manufacturing base so we can all rest more easily at night, not only in the best of times, but during the next pandemic.
I have a slightly provocative question, which is, do you think Brussels or Washington have anything to learn from Beijing in terms of industrial strategy, or in terms, whether it's in R&D in the innovative sector, or whether it's propping up manufacturing? I mean, is China doing something well that we should be copying?
Oh, absolutely, Carla. China has engaged in a very strategic, brilliant, I'll call it industrial policy. The government invested heavily in antibiotic infrastructure 20 years ago, but then it dumped it on the global market and drove out producers in the United States, India, and elsewhere. But it realizes the strategic importance of a country having the ability to make its own basic medicines and then export that to the rest of the world. It realizes the importance of creating jobs for more than 1 billion people to grow its economy. And the jobs come not just from innovation, which China is also investing in and probably will supersede Western countries in just a short period of time. But these are things that we need to secure. And I have been recommending testimony to Congress that the United States needs to view even these basic medicines as a strategic asset for our country, just as China has done, in a very smart policy. They have a plan, they have a policy, and I don't see much criticism here in the United States from that. And yet, when we begin to talk about industrial policy here in the US, it's a non-starter. That's unfortunate.
Natalie, I saw you raise your hand there.
Yeah.
I'll give you the floor.
Sure, and I completely join what was just been said, what Rosemary just said, and I'll add that in addition to their manufacturing and industrial policy, they have the strongest innovation policy of the world, maybe next to the US. So they've invested an amazing amount in biotech and in innovation over the last 15, 20 years. And that has this two-pronged approach enables them to be able to innovate, create, and then manufacture. And this is what I'm a bit concerned about at the moment when I look at some of the policy proposals in the review of the pharma legislation. We're focusing perhaps on manufacturing and we're forgetting about innovation. But if you have no innovation, you don't have anything to manufacture except of existing drugs, which is one element. But this is not how we're going to solve the biggest challenges. We're not facing COVID with existing medicines. We had to find those new vaccines. We have to find those new treatments. So we need a combination of everything. And China has been incredibly consistent, very predictable, and very bullish in investing in innovation as well.
Michelle, please. I wanted to ask you, because right at the start, you actually seemed quite skeptical of the government's ability to pick winners and losers in terms of biotech. So, what's your take on all of this? Should we be looking at Beijing?
I am so glad you drew that distinction, because what Beijing is doing is not picking winners and losers. What Beijing is doing is really stimulating and encouraging the development of as many possibilities as possible. I'll give you a very concrete example. We've had a huge controversy here in the US about accelerated approval over a recent Alzheimer's drug. And the whole question is, should we have accelerated approval? And even though our accelerated approval system really usually only lets through 1 or 2 innovations, can we let those go forward without 100% guarantee that they're going to show huge clinical benefit? Forgetting the fact that this whole system was put in place to get new drugs developed for HIV, for example. And the first of those, AZT, was far from perfect, but what it produced in its wake was hugely influential. China is taking the complete opposite approach. They're saying, we're just not going to accelerate one therapy in an indication. We're going to accelerate 5, more than 5, up to 10 areas of new therapies in an indication space. And then we're going to let all of those out into the world to compete for clinical benefit, price, side effect profiles, and the winner will rise to the top and be incredibly competitive with anything that comes out of development in the West. We are going to lose this race, and it is a race, let's make no bones about it, if we continue to be skeptical and doubtful and hinder innovation. We need to be doing everything we can to get more innovation out there, to capture the data about how it works as quickly as possible, so that we can then have more competitors out in the global landscape and give our patients in Western countries, in the US and in Europe, more options that are not dependent on non-Western sources.
I mean, that is, absolutely fascinating, a very interesting approach. But, I have to be the skeptical voice here and say, aren't we being a bit laissez-faire with the patients here? I take your point about the drug. I believe it's called
Aldeham.
Yes, Aldeham. But that was because Alzheimer's is such a difficult disease area that the exception was made in that case, and we can debate whether it was a good idea or not. But with other disease areas, isn't it a bit risky to just push as many drugs as we can on the market and see what works and what doesn't? Michelle, over to you.
Accelerated approval is not about pushing as many drugs out into the market and then see if they work. It's about taking very promising early stage results and trying to grow that body of knowledge so that we really know what works for patients. What's laissez-faire for patients is to slow the course of innovation, because if you've ever had a family member that is waiting on a breakthrough that has yet to exist, the biggest enemy is time and delay. And so we need to do everything we can to give patients who have exhausted their current clinical choices, new options, and then learn as quickly as possible from those options what's the full scope of patients that will work for them. I'm not calling for what China is doing, which would shock many in the West, which is they have an entire province that has been designated an innovation province, and phase 3 clinical trials can easily take place in this space. It's like saying that you're going to try all new drugs in Kansas, whether or not you know if they completely work. That's not an approach that will work in the West. But we have enough scientific know-how right now to really understand and predict how promising compounds are going to work in the larger ecosystem. And what we do instead is we make perfect the enemy and the good, and we do things like we did in the COVID juvenile vaccine trials, where we increase clinical trial sizes from 5,000 to 30,000 patients, hoping we'll detect a 1 in a million occurrence. Neither 5,000 patients nor 30,000 patients is going to detect a 1 in a million occurrence. You will only detect that with real world evidence and with very tight surveillance of new medical products as they come to market.
Sure. No, absolutely. And, I wanted to also discuss the very tight involvement we've seen between the pharmaceutical governments, between the governments and pharmaceutical companies over the course of vaccine development, because I think that's such a fascinating example, because we've seen both big successes and some very tense moments. I'm thinking about the relationship between AstraZeneca and the Commission, for example. So Natalie, I want to ask you, what has the industry learned about working with government in the past 12 months. And, what learnings are you going to take forward, and what would you rather leave behind?
I'd rather leave COVID behind, but it doesn't seem to be working so far. I think, Carlo, COVID has been one of those test cases that was such a test case, we still don't know how to manage it. And everything that we've had to endure over these months personally, but also as an industry, as a health community, has been extraordinary. And I'm not trying to water down the things that have happened, but I'm just trying to put them into the real context in which we experience them. And Michelle mentioned how many compounds were in development. I remember when we had 130 vaccines being developed, and as we mentioned, we just over a handful right now that seem to be working, therapeutics and other things. So I think what we will hopefully hold on to, Carlo, is the importance of communication. And at one point in the first 6 months, we had weekly calls as a healthcare industry, not just ours, but the whole chain, with the Commission, with member states, to make sure products reach patients. And those were 1-hour calls every Friday to fix things like, borders being shut, trucks being stuck in traffic, and city things like that. But they worked. We found solutions in order to make sure that every patient got what they needed when they needed it. What I will leave behind is any prejudice that any actor is not doing everything they can, because we have all been doing everything that we possibly can, because our common enemy is COVID, and our common objective is getting out of under this thing and being able to be healthy and be economically viable as a planet again. So I hope we've learned a lot. I really hope we can continue that collaboration, as I said, as we create that framework for future innovation, because if we get it wrong, we won't be in such a comfortable place next time we have to deal with hopefully we don't have another pandemic, but I heard you, Rosemary, say next time we have to deal with a pandemic. I want Europe to be a front player again. I want us to be able to help, just like we did this time. And the way we decide on our regulation in the next few years will define that.
Great. On the topic of innovation, Rosemary, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned, which was that new ways of manufacturing might be one way to help shore up some of that pharmaceutical resilience. I guess the idea being here that maybe new technologies mean that it starts to make more economic sense again to build a plant in the US or build it in Europe, when obviously before we had that cutthroat economic competition, which meant that they all left for Asia. What kind of technologies are we talking about, and what is the government's role in helping roll those out, and how far away are they? Are we talking about in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, or in the next 20?
These are advanced manufacturing processes that have been used in the chemical industry for 100 years. But because of a lack of financial incentives, both in the generic space and the branded space for different reasons, they have not been adopted. But the good news is we're beginning to see in the generic space and some in the branded space adopt advanced manufacturing, which allows for, among other things, more cost competitive production, as well as green production, as mentioned earlier. But I want to touch on something that was discussed earlier. It's about the safety of our medicines. Advanced manufacturing allows for real-time quality control, which we don't have by far to the same degree now with batch manufacturing. This allows, the advanced manufacturing allows this real-time quality control. And remember that we're in an age now where, and I give credit to the European Medicines Agency, again, this is on the generic side, they came out with a very courageous statement, I believe back in 2012, that said that we acknowledge that we are in the position of having to approve the sale of prescription drugs in the EU that don't meet our standards to avert shortages. The FDA, I have not seen a statement like that, but that's in effect what they're doing. And we saw millions of people in the United States, Europe, and other countries that had their, for example, blood pressure medicines recalled because of carcinogens, very high levels of carcinogens in them. So there was a complete breakdown in the quality control of our generic drugs. And moreover, we're seeing the FDA, at least from this side, having difficulty getting access to do inspections in China. And I think we're seeing an FDA that regrettably is rather crippled in being able to protect the public. So this creates the urgency for public-private partnerships for investment in advanced manufacturing, where FDA inspectors don't have to travel around the globe, that we can use technology to ensure that the safety in the manufacturing space of our products. And you know, Carla, trust is everything for patients. We want to be able to trust whether our old line generics are made properly or whether new drugs on the market are what they are going to do, what they say they're going to do. And so we have to ensure that we have a public that trusts product. It's all about trust. And advanced manufacturing is a way to help build that trust in the medicines that we rely on, every pill, every vial, every time.
Sure. No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have Michelle here who worked at the FDA. So I was curious to, get your opinion on what Rosemary just said. I mean, is there problems with how the FDA is conducting inspections in your opinion? And would investing more in manufacturing closer to home be a solution for that?
I was just sitting here going, amen, in the back of my head as Rosemary was speaking. She's absolutely right. We are crippled from getting the information that we so desperately need. And look, our biopharma companies have gotten a lot of mixed signals over the last 18 months. Prior to COVID, the direction was do everything you can to decrease the cost of production. That led to a lot of offshoring of manufacturing, assuming that we would have access to the information we needed and the transportation we needed to get those goods back to patients around the globe. Then immediately after the pandemic hit, it was onshore, absolutely everything you can, because we need to make sure all manufacturing is done in the US. Obviously, now we're facing calls around COVID vaccines and therapeutics that we must have redundant manufacturing facilities in every major continent around the globe. I don't think we're on the hook for Antarctica yet, but for every other corner of the globe. We can't really survive the whiplash of different directives that are coming down the pike. We need to figure out how we're going to manufacture globally. We need to realize that there are patients in every corner of the globe, and we need to be able to effectively, efficiently, and cheaply get medical supplies to all of those regions of the globe. And we need a global regulatory regime that is more harmonized and cooperative so that we're not jumping through repetitive hoops to get the same compounds out to similar patients and with similar needs.
Great. I have a question from the audience on HERA and how it compares to BARDA, and I want to ask that to you, Natalie. But before I get to that one, since we're on the topic of reshoring, I did want to ask Rosemary, also a question from the audience, but also for me, they ask, would the whole reshoring trend, if it happens, raise the price tag of treatments for patients? And if it does, is it desirable? I think that does seem like a sensible question. If the reason why these industries left the US and Europe was because they could make medicines more cheaply elsewhere, then I guess it does stand to reason that the price goes up. But, maybe that's something we're willing to accept. What do you think, Rosemary?
Carla, I think with two steps, advanced manufacturing, which for a number of products can reduce the cost of production by 30 to 40%. But also, we have to be mindful that this notion of generic competition lowers price. I would want to call to everyone's attention this report by the Coalition for Prosperous America. What we see happen is that particularly countries in Asia will sell a product at below market price, drive out their, quote, competitors. And then when those competitors, including domestic manufacturers, are out of business, the price goes up. And there are case examples of multiple generic drugs where this has happened. One only has to look at the vitamin C cartel case that went to the US Supreme Court, where the Chinese government companies acknowledged that their government required them to fix prices and to dump on the global market, including the United States, driving out US producers and then increasing the cost of ascorbic acid vitamin C. This is documented in the China RX book, as is China's penicillin cartel. So we have to bear in mind that we've got a lot of price manipulation going on. And a final point I want to make is this is just a great story for us to understand the reality on the ground. I spoke with a pharmaceutical manufacturing executive who's been in the industry many years, and he went to refill his generic drug prescription. It was a common blood pressure medicine, and the price at the retail pharmacy was $157.50. And he said to me, guess how much the manufacturer would be paid for that? I said, $20. He said, no, $1. So there's something we have to look at in this pricing that it's not the manufacturing side. There's something else going on that takes out value for the customer in terms of price.
Absolutely. We will definitely be returning to that topic of price, but I did want to go to Dolores, I believe, who has joined us now. Hi, Dolores. Really good to have you here. We've just been discussing, China reshoring, how the government can stimulate innovation. It's been a really broad discussion, and it's great to have you here. MEP for the EPP group from Spain. Dolores, you've also are the rapporteur for the Parliament's own initiative report on the pharmaceutical strategy. So maybe we can start with that. What is the pharmaceutical strategy for you? How are you approaching it from Parliament? And how do you think it's going to improve how Brussels and the member countries interface with the pharmaceutical industry?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm so happy to be here today with you. First of all, I want to focus and highlight that the negotiations with all the political groups in the parliament on the pharmaceutical strategy at the beginning have not been any easy duty. At the beginning, everybody was standing on perhaps ideological positions with a confrontation between lowering price and cost on one side and incentivize innovation on the other, and the need for a broader access to medicines in the middle. So I can say that everybody has given a contribution to meet somewhere in between, prioritizing the patients while not forgetting that we cannot foster innovation in health without a strong, resilient, and competitive pharmaceutical industry, supported by a strong IP rights protection system and ruled by a predictable, agile, and updated regulatory system. There is no innovation without access. It is essential to invest in health innovation that brings together science and business in ecosystems focused on people and their needs. Effective disease control requires innovation, and patients need early, accurate, and less invasive diagnosis that effectively guide new, more effective and less harmful treatments. So from direct experience as a Minister of Health, I know that often patients' access to these innovative diagnostics and treatments is still limited because the health system is not prepared to integrate and offer them due to the high cost. So innovation cannot be an obstacle. A balance must be found between innovation, its accessibility, and the sustainability of the system. So perhaps this is one of the most important objectives of this pharmaceutical strategy. And then we all know that drug pricing is a competence of member states, and the pharmaceutical strategy don't ask for change it. But we suggest to the Commission and to the member states to share the best practices on pricing and to take into account the innovation made in Europe. And in the same time, to take into account when they are putting a price, if that medicine gives a really a good value for all the population. So perhaps, the strategy makes first the passion on the center of the all health policies. Second important thing, innovation, and research. So I can say that this decade, it is the decade of health in Europe and the decade of innovation. And third thing, for us, very important, it is, we need a competitiveness and resilient industry, pharmaceutical industry in Europe and all around the world. And fourth thing, very important, that I explained before, the sustainability of our health public systems. Why? Because this is one big difference between the rest of our competitors, as United States or as China. We have universal public health systems all around Europe. So this is a big thing that we have to protect. So perhaps, this can be a resume of all the strategy in just 2 minutes.
Great. No, that was very broad, but very to the point at the same time. So it's appreciated. Natalie, I wanted to go over to you because, rhetorically, from what Dolores is saying, it seems like you're very aligned, actually, at least from the point of view of words. But at the same time, you seem a little skeptical about the strategy. So I wanted to give the floor over to you and just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, and nice to see you, Dolores. I think, there are different intentions with this pharma strategy, and Dolores is explaining very clearly the intentions of helping Europe regain its position as an innovation center for pharma. But when I look at the questionnaire, at the public consultation on the pharma strategy, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of proposals about reducing incentives, about reshaping incentives. There's a lot of destabilizing proposals in there. There are also some very good proposals about strengthening the regulatory framework, making sure we have global regulatory convergence, all the things that we do need. But there are some very concerning elements in there. And those elements, if there is a destabilizing, a reduction of incentives, if there are those connections between access and incentives made in the regulatory framework, I think that you will find very quickly a reduction in interest and in investment in Europe, considering, as we mentioned earlier in this panel today, how fast China and the US are continuing to invest to create a platform that is attractive for investment. So I think we really cannot take our eye off the ball, that you have to have a coherent story as a policymaker and as in a review of legislation that makes investors and companies reassured that, yes, if I invest my money in Europe, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to be available to me, and I'm going to be able to create innovation, manufacture, and sell it.
Great. And I do want to also return to that audience question, which is, has it been created with what it takes to replicate BARDA's work? First I want to ask you that, Natalie, and then I want to ask Dolores as well.
I think there are some things that we can still continue to fine tune. In the US, we saw the Yavi-BARDA collaboration as a really fantastic example of an effective mechanism to fill the pipelines. We don't have that yet at European level, so we need to see what we can do to enable that not just SMEs can work with each other, but also we can have a bigger collaboration. Is there anything under the European Defence Fund or something that can be replicated under Horizon or EU for Health and things like that? I think if we can be a little bit more creative, we should be able to make even more out of the current HERA proposal.
And Dolores, do you have any thoughts about HERA, how it compares with the US BARDA, what could be improved?
Yes, I'm totally agree on what was explaining now Natalie. It is very important for Europe. The pandemic highlight the vulnerability of global supply chains and insufficient oversight of manufacturing capacities, as well as health research priorities across the European Union. The new Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, HERA, is created to strengthen Europe's capacity to prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to cross-border threats, ensuring the timely and equitable development, manufacture, procurement, and distribution of all medical products needed to deal with the health crisis. The Biodefense Preparedness Plan Herta incubator is now up and running. It is successfully facilitating now contacts and cooperation between member state regulatory authorities, other public authorities, and industry, as well as between industry actors involved in the supply chain. We cannot compare BARDA with ERA, as well as we cannot compare United States with European Union as with United States in terms of drug pricing and other health competence that are not managed at union level. But ERA really represents a big step ahead for the European shared goal to be more and better prepared to future health emergencies. And ERA is going to help us to do not have health nationalism, because we saw at the beginning of the COVID, in the earlier stage of the pandemic, health nationalism between the state members. Much at the end of COVID and during the last month of COVID, we saw that we have been achieved thanks to the Union joint response. So ERA is a really good tool that Europe needs, and I'm sure that we are going to approach this ERA to BARDA working.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Dolores. I realize we are getting towards the end of our panel, so I wanted to ask one more kind of quick, keep it to roughly a minute question to all of our panelists, which is, one thing that strikes me more and more as I speak with people, with experts such as yourself, is that there has been a kind of turning point with the pandemic, and pharmaceuticals, of course, always a very political sector. People really care about their drugs and their health, but it seems like the pandemic has made it even more political, even more strategic as a sector. And I think whenever something becomes more strategic, we've seen it with microchips, and you see it with the defense industry, there is more government intervention. Governments involve themselves in the business of these sectors. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you see government intervention in the sector as a positive or as a negative. Natalie, I wanted to start with you since you represent the industry in Europe, and then I thought we could go to Dolores and then continue from there. So Natalie?
Thanks, Carl. That's a difficult question because government intervention can be seen in so many different, decline in so many different ways. I think what is important is that whatever intervention there is, as Michelle was saying at the beginning, that the demarcations are very clear of who does what and why and what that means. So if there is an investment, how much was invested by which part? If there is a role in IP, what does that mean in the future? And as partners, as an industry, we have partnered in this pandemic more than we've ever partnered before, with more different actors and in a faster way and in a more creative way ever. So I think we've stretched ourselves. We've learned a lot. We've learned about things that don't work either. So as long as the rules of the game are very clear from the beginning and then that they're stuck to, we can make the most of all of our assets and enable that continued innovation that we need to face any health threat, not just pandemic. So I would encourage us all to collaborate with very clear rules of the game and with the idea of fostering innovation at the center of what we do.
Great. Perfect. Dolores?
Yeah, thank you. Look, European Union is a liberal democracy. So this is the reason why we are well aware of the key role of public-private partnerships to foster innovation, and the new pharmaceutical strategy several times highlights its crucial importance for the future of the fight against all the disease. In the Parliament, we just approved a series of 9 work programs worth some 20 billion euro on public-private initiatives, including the new Innovative Health Initiative, which aims to help fund research in pharmaceuticals and medical device, and is a successor of the Innovative Medicines Initiative. So to make the public-private partnerships really effective in health research, production, and distribution, we need to be centered on patients, of course, needs driving innovation, on resilient supply chains, and policies predictability to allow the industry to thrive. So in the pharmaceutical strategy, I have support the Commission in its efforts to conduct a structured dialogue with relevant actors in the pharmaceutical value chain, public authorities, non-governmental patients, and health organizations, health professionals, including pharmacists and the research community, as one of the tools to address the root causes of medicines shortage and weakness in the global manufacturing and supply chain of essential medicines. And moreover, I have called for a high-level political pharmaceutical forum to bring together policymakers, regulators, payers, patients, organizations, industry representatives, and other stakeholders in the healthcare supply chain to share lessons learned from the COVID-19. So Natalie was telling, that we have to join more together. For me, perhaps in the last 10 years, we can see, we saw how the public administration in all levels, it was running in one direction, patients in another direction, and industry in another direction. This we have to finish. And this is the reason why I'm totally agree on what the Commission put on the table, that it is this structured dialogue. But in the same time, I call a high-level political pharmaceutical forum in all Europe, because all together we have to build this European Union for health that we start to build just now after COVID.
Great. It seems like we've lost Michelle, so Rosemary, over to you. Final remarks on government intervention in the sector.
Carlo, government intervention is very important where there are classic cases of market failure and where it serves the public interest. Where there are public goods that need to be supplied and where the market isn't doing it. And also there's a role for government in assuring the safety of our medicines. And I just want to take 30 seconds to go back to the global harmonization of the regulatory system. What we've seen in the past 20 years in the decline in the quality of our generic drugs is unthinkable to what, if you ask professionals who've been in the industry 30, 40 years, the number of recalls, the poor quality of what inspectors from the European Medicines Agency and the FDA see when they go inspect plants, particularly in Asia and elsewhere, is extremely troubling. So there is a public interest in government intervention, ensuring that our medicines that we rely on are what made the way they're supposed to be. And in any kind of global harmonization of the regulatory system, we need to raise the bar, not lower it.
Well, that is, you couldn't have said it better, because that brings me right to the poll. And I'm looking at the poll results right now, and actually the most voted for answer. And just as a reminder, the question was, which are the key areas where we should strengthen transatlantic collaboration to allow for sustainable innovation of medicines? And the most voted on answer was greater regulatory harmonization between markets. After that, it was collaboration between authorities like HERA and BARDA, then open trade and free flow of goods, and then IP and incentives framework. So it does seem like there's a real demand for different countries to align more. With that, we reached the end of our discussion. I want to thank again to our speakers and our viewers online. And I also want to thank our partner Janssen for making this event possible. We're hosting our last event on the Evolution of Healthcare series in December, and that will be focusing on the health consequences of climate change. You can visit our website for more information, and we're always happy to hear your feedback, so please do send it at live@politico.eu. Thanks again for watching, and see you in December.